Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Not Afraid. I am Carrie Bartholomew or Carob Marcelle, depending on where you know me from. And I wanted to continue this interview series. I feel a strong pressure that I need to get certain conversations out probably before November, if you know what I mean. Um, because it's important that we hear these different voices. And so today, my guest is a long time coming. I've admired from a distance, and that is Animosity Ari. I first saw him. I first saw him uh, on Benjamin Boyce, and I just thought, oh my goodness, it's the epitome of chic, and
Oh.
just how cool and based this person was. I felt like it was important. Now we aren't doing this live. I think that it's probably out of an abundance of precaution as my channel is so small, but um but we wanted to protect this person because we know that the kindness crowd isn't always kind. So welcome, Ari.
Thanks for having me, Kari.
So I just want to talk about, first you are in the process of detransitioning, correct?
Yes, well, as much as you can when you've removed your genitals.
Wow. I always wonder, I don't wonder in terms of like it's not my business, right? But at the same time, you never know at what level someone is at. And I guess we just jump right in. We have an hour and I guess we just jump in there. I had not expected to do that. What in the world? Why did you make that decision?
It's actually a long story. I was a homeless, autistic, traumatized teenager jumping from place to place. I don't think I had stable housing for longer than a month for a couple of years when I was younger. And I very quickly got caught up into an LGBT center, mostly because I was seeking free therapy and support for the trauma I had when I was a child. Because I did that, though, I got in support groups filled with trans identified males almost 20 years ago, and I got completely embedded in this idea that the issues I had with my body were trans and that transition was the solution. Um, and so I started transitioning a long time ago. But I had autism and epilepsy, which actually got worse in transition. But nobody told me that. Nobody told me that the transition might be making it worse. And so I was completely disabled for almost all of my 20s and a huge section of my teen years. And I traveled across the country disabled, selling myself along the way, thinking that the only thing that would make the pain stop, the psychological torment I was in, was to finish my transition. But I couldn't finish my transition because I was an epileptic. So I had this huge drive, and moved across the country, put my seizures in remission, and finished my transition, only to really find out that that didn't solve the problem and it wasn't going to go away, because the problem wasn't that I was a woman trapped in a man's body and I needed to carve up my body. The problem was that I was autistic, gay, and traumatized.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. The first thing is autism because I have felt for a long time that the autistic community is targeted by into this. There's a lot of people who seem to be both trans and autistic. Is that correct?
I don't think that they're targeted per se. I think that if you're on the spectrum, you're going to be very isolated. You're going to have a hard time connecting with other kids. If you're effeminate and you're on the spectrum, that means you're going to have a lot of rumination about like your differences from other boys, about that disconnect and why you don't connect with other boys, why you only connect with girls, why all your friends are girls, why you like effeminate things. You're on the spectrum and you're ruminating on that. that's going to lead to an obsession and that's going to cause issues as you develop, right? So I think that when it comes to being different and isolated, that makes you more vulnerable to the community, and to the love bombing and support you get when you ideate as trans. But then also, autism adds that deep thinking, internalized rumination. And so any problems you have can be made worse by that. Like the idea that something was wrong with me because of the trauma when I was a kid, and that was put in my head that it was my fault what was happening to me as a child. That was something I ruminated on and fixated on as a child as I grew up. And it compounded with the differences between me and other children, that I liked romance novels, that all my friends were girls, that I was softer and I tend to be more shy and demure. All of these things added up with the idea that something was wrong with me, and the autism caused me to ruminate on that and fixate on it very, very young. So then when I found out of trans, it was like, this is it. This is the solution. This is the thing. Obviously, this makes sense. I feel so out of place. I don't feel right as a boy. There's no way I can be a man. There's no way I can do this in life. And trans becomes the outlet, the escape.
So you said you started off very, very young. How? What were you exposed to that even introduced it?
So I didn't start out young in transition. I started out young in gender confusion.
Okay.
I started out when I was homeless as a teenager transitioning, but I started being gender confused when I was around 8 years old, 7, 8 years old. And I was very disconnected from other boys at school. I kind of saw them as like little animals. Like they were little mini mirrors of my stepdad, this authoritarian, abusive, domineering figure. And I didn't connect and relate to that. And I was reading a lot of romance novels and growing up isolated, alone, just reading these books. I connected with the princess in the books. I wanted to be the princess. I wanted to fall in love with the prince. I wanted my white knight to come save me from my stepdad. Um, and so, like, I mean, I think really the gender confusion was in part trauma induced and disassociating from being a male and being a man because I was exposed to such an abusive man during my developmental window. And I think in part it was that natural association you have with girls when you are different as a man and you're growing up as a proto gay child.
And you are, I mean, we've met in person. You are rather petite. So that probably was hard when, boys around that age are starting to get into sports
I
and
was tiny. I was put on SSRIs as a kid.
oh,
So I was 5 foot flat and 80 pounds when I went into the eighth grade. I was tiny. Going into high school, I was 6, 7 inches shorter than the other boys. I was much smaller. I did not develop muscle. My genitals were underformed from the SSRIs and everything. And, when I was scared to go into locker rooms as a kid, I remember going into high school the first time I went into a locker room with all the other boys, and they were all so much astronomically bigger than me. And I was learning that I liked guys, and I was ashamed and horrified. And I was scared that they would see that I liked being in there. So I stayed out of the locker room. I actually, freshman year, I started wearing gym shorts underneath my school clothes, and I would take the school clothes off in the bathroom and pack them all up in a bag and then go into the gym, and I would never go into the locker room. Then I would put my normal clothes on over my gym clothes and just walk around with sweaty gym clothes because I did not want to go into the locker room.
so let's talk about the LGBTQ center. You went into those as a teenager, and that is not what was that like?
It was like I was volunteering the front desk at a place next to it, and I found out they offered free therapy. And the free therapy seemed good. It wasn't a trans person, it was a normal person, had a normal practice, and came in there as a volunteer to help people with their dysphoria and gender issues. But the support group was the opposite. And I didn't really see it the way I do now at the time. Like, now I see it in a completely different light. And looking back, I was a teenager, and the closest person to me was a decade older. They were 27. And they had male pattern baldness and were severely obsessed about their appearance. And the next people to them were in their 30s and 40s. This was in a military zone, so all of these men went into the military, had wives and kids, came out, tried to make a real man out of themselves by going into the military, and then transitioned out of the military. And nobody explained what autogynephilia was to me. Nobody explained the two typology model. Everything was described under this framework of trans, and I didn't know what I was interacting with when I was in that support group. And so I had this idea that this was the solution to my problem that was also being put next to this horrifying image. Like, I did not want to be like these men. I did not want to look like them. And that fed this idea that I have to do this now. I can't be like them. If I start going bald, I can't be like this guy. He looks like he's going to unalive. He's depressed. He's obsessed with his hair. I have to go fast, hard, now. Um, and that's actually how I started doing DIY. That was the motives to start doing DIY while being diagnosed.
What is
Um,
DIY?
do it yourself hormones. Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit? Like
Yeah, there's
what?
a huge, extensive DIY market of illicit black market hormones that will ship to minors and does not care if you have a prescription. You can go to DIY market. You can Google search DIY HRT market, and it'll come up with a huge website with a repository of like 20, 30 pharmacies. And that kind of marketplace has existed for multiple decades. The federal government has done nothing about it. And back in the day, when you went on the internet and you had these kind of questions, early internet, or you went into these support groups, these resources would be directly shared with you, right? Nowadays, it's more on the internet and less in person because children are so embedded into social media. What happened in the support group when I was a kid now happens on Instagram, it happens on Reddit, it happens on Facebook, and it's as simple as a group of these kinds of men interacting with a young person and then giving them resources. And some of these pharmacies will ship these things masked to get past parental scrutiny. There's HRT marketed as perfume that you can order. There's countries where HRT has been found on the TikTok market, TikTok shop.
Yeah, yeah. Is this a situation? I'm thinking about the group that you were in with all of these older men. Did they do things like tell you, "Oh, you would look so good as a girl"?
Yeah, and you're so lucky to be able to do this now. I wish I could have done this when I was your age. You're going to end up so much happier. Like, you're going to be so fulfilled. Like, that was the messaging, was that I was so blessed to be able to sterilize myself young because I had a shot at being pretty.
So, I've heard this term fisher. Is that would you call these people fishers? The people, do you know what that
We
means?
use the term pink pilling.
Pink pilling.
Yeah, or that it's this is in reference to the egg culture, which is this culture trans people have of cracking your egg and helping you realize that you're trans. Um,
Right.
yeah, it's grooming.
Right. And that's what I was wondering about these centers because we've got them popping up everywhere, youth centers. And at the same time, kids are learning language like who is your quote unquote trusted adult, as opposed to talk to your parent. It's talk to your trusted adult. To me, that language sounds like grooming. Now, I am, not in that space. So I'm looking at it as an observer from the outside, but that's what it seems like. Why are you asking for trusted adults
Well,
constantly?
in many ways, trans operates like a religion. This is why I say it's a cult. This is why I call myself an apostate, right? Trans has many mechanisms that operate almost on a spiritual level, if you think about it. You let your old self die. your dead name. You let go of your old self and you're reborn, you're new, you're embracing your true self, right? This is like being a born again Christian. Like you are going through a rebirth. And that rebirth comes with its own community, with its belief set, with its
Mhm.
culture. And that's again where autistic people get sucked right in because you have that community, you have that connection, right? At the same time, like it's teaching you that anybody who doesn't accept your new identity is bad. They're rejecting you. They're not embracing your true self, right? And they teach people to isolate, to cut off those who actually genuinely love them. And the thing is the people who are actually pushing back against you are people who are genuinely, love you and care about you. They are genuinely concerned about your well-being. But the culture of trans says that concern is hate, so you have to
Right.
cut them off. And this is actually what's another thing that's really funny is the average regret time for post-gonadectomy, for transition, for my demographic was 8 to 10 years. The average time someone spends embedded in a cult is 8 to 10 years.
Wow. And then what
Mm-hmm.
happens when they get out? I mean, because you've destroyed a lot of relationships, I'm assuming. I mean, I don't know how many people, especially if they're friends, family may be different, but I think 8 to 10 years is still a long time to have, to be considered evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess in a way, that's the silver lining of having a really damaged family and a dark past. Like, I didn't have much of a relationship with most of my family. And the family I do have a relationship with is very loving and supportive because they weren't the ones who got to raise me. And, I wouldn't have gone through this if the other side of my family had raised me. Um, so I have the good part of my family in my life, and the bad part of my family probably wouldn't have been a relationship that would have been maintained without trans. And I had such an abnormal childhood that I didn't have a lot of friends as a kid. I was isolated and abused. I was in and out of hospitals and institutions because of the trauma, which is actually really interesting. I got diagnosed within a year of being diagnosed with PTSD from CSA. Um,
That's when you got diagnosed being trans?
yeah, within a year of getting out of the hospital, I spent a year and a half in a residential institution because of what happened to me as a kid, and getting treatment for that. When I was when I was like 15, I checked myself into an institution, got diagnosed, got treatment, got out, was on my own shortly thereafter, and was learning about trans just after that.
So, I believe it's Sweden. I could be wrong about the country, so don't quote me on that, but I believe that it's Sweden that originally had the first, like, transitioning clinics, and before you could go through surgery, you needed, like, 7 years of therapy,
Yeah,
and that just changed all of the sudden? Why would that change when those were the people who had the best outcomes?
well, because as a result of activism, they watered down all the gatekeeping and they depathologized trans. That's what they did. They watered down the gatekeeping, they depathologized it, they promoted an affirmation model. But even before the affirmation model, it was still foundationally flawed because gender identity isn't a real concept. It's not something that's proven. It's purely in people's head. And so they were modifying people's bodies to affirm delusions for 100 years and nobody cared. But that's not an ethical thing to do, and we don't do that with any other mental illness. We don't go around telling anorexics that they are fat and then offering them liposuction. We don't allow doctors to do amputations on people with body integrity disorder just because they feel like they shouldn't have that arm or leg. But we do this with gender identity, and it's completely illogical. And like from the
And it's the
beginning,
most violent.
it's very violent,
I
incredibly
mean, it's
violent.
the
It's the
when
destruction
you
of
said it
your
when you
sex. It's the destruction of your
yeah,
genitals, of your gonads, of your
yeah.
reproductive ability, of your health, and all of that in the name of affirming a delusion. And then it gets even more insidious when you start to look at trans history and you realize that they've never actually tried to figure out what trans is. in an efficient, like they've never gone at the root of the problem. As it stands, we have 120 years of history, 125 years of history that says that trans is multiple things, that gender identity is caused by multiple paths, that nonconformity is caused by multiple things. And all throughout the DSM, we've never differentiated homosexuals with trauma or any of the different motivating factors for homosexual transition from autogynephilic transitioners, which are obviously very real concept. I mean, it's observable by anyone who looks at the framework of autogynephilia that autogynephilia is a percentage of people who transitions, but we don't diagnose it.
I want to break that down a little bit. Remember, my audience tends to be those moms, grandparents, whatever, who are
Okay.
just like, what's going on? So the first thing is what's DSM?
The DSM is the diagnostic standards for basically it's the manual for diagnosing someone with a condition, psychological condition, and the problem with trans and with gender dysphoria is nothing more than a list of symptoms, right? And multiple different conditions can qualify you for this list of symptoms. I was diagnosed under the DSM 4. What caused my discomfort was CSA, PTSD reactions to my genitals, rumination throughout my childhood around trauma and gender nonconformity that led to cross sex ideation. It's all psychological, it's all environmental, what caused me to be this way, right? But we didn't diagnose the why behind
Right.
why I felt that way. And nowadays we treat that as conversion therapy. And I think really this mindset has happened as the result of activism. And why has this happened? Why have they been fighting to basically not ask why people feel this way? The reason they've been fighting is right here on the shelf. It's Magnus Hirschfeld, it's trans history, it's the erotic drive to cross dress. All the way back through trans history, they've always split males who had gender identity issues into multiple different demographics. There was always homosexuals who were homosexuals. Sorry, I've been on TikTok too much.
You're okay.
Homosexuals who are non-conforming and have various different reasons for cross-sex ideation. A lot of it being trauma-based and not fitting into a sexist traditionalist society as an atypical male. And then you have the erotic drive to cross dress, what Blanchard coined as autogynephilia. And these two things have always run alongside each other, and both of these groups have always transitioned under the same framework. Back to DSM transsexualism, to gender identity disorder, to gender dysphoria. Homosexual transsexuals and autogynephilic transsexuals have both always transitioned under one label, which is really the problem. We have a generalized label that's been watered down and made more general. We have an ideology that's promoted the concept of not asking the question why, because asking why is bigotry. And embedded within the ideology, we have a group of men with very perverse motivations for wanting to live this life. And you add all that together with the activism, and you see how we got here. This is why I'm the transphobic historian, and why reading trans history caused me to crack and detransition.
How did that feel to know, like, I mean, were you just one day living your life and then the next day you're like, what the hell did I get myself into?
No, no, that
Okay.
felt like getting canceled as a left wing Bernie-crat working on a Jewish candidate for city council and getting canceled by the trans community and called a Nazi, even though I'm the right hand man of the only Jewish candidate for city council, and then going, what the heck is going on with trans people? Getting
Mhm.
online, talking to some turfs, and a lot of research, almost like this
And for those of
form.
you who don't know, a TERF is a trans exclusionary feminist.
Yeah, trans
Um,
exclusionary radical
Radical.
feminist or an impacted woman. Any woman that says something that upsets a trans person.
Okay.
Um, because it's
I'm like,
both an
okay.
actual political label with its own belief set and it's just a label they throw at anyone to be like bigot.
Right,
You
right.
upset me. You said something I don't like. But I was talking to turfs and I was doing this form of almost like self exploration, exploring
Okay.
trans, exploring what causes trans, looking for true trans, a biological origin to trans, some ephemeral thing you can put your finger on and say this is what makes people trans. I couldn't find it. All through history, I couldn't find it. I kept looking and looking and looking, dumping money on books. Some of these books, the ones over here off camera, these were printed in 1914. You know,
Wow.
some of these books are written by the fathers of transsexualism. They're the books the Nazis burned in the Hirschfeld Institute. These are literally the books the Nazis burned in the Hirschfeld Institute. Um, this one's written by John Money, so I just researched obsessively, trying to understand what is this thing I got involved in, and I became incredibly depressed. At the same time, I was interviewing people and talking to trans people, and everybody was different. And I was like, oh, this is not, it's all lies. What is the truth? And I kept looking and looking and looking, and all I found was human experimentation in the early 20th century that turned into an ideology over 100 years that now is being preached in schools, being preached in libraries, being supported by the government, even though we do not have enough data to show this is necessary, even though we have no evidence that this is a natural thing.
In
None.
fact,
We
it
have
feels like we have
none.
the opposite. It seems to me that we have the opposite. I don't know. You hear everything from all sorts of all over the place, but one of the things that I've heard is that people are more likely to commit suicide after they
Oh,
transition.
yeah, no, 100%. There's recent studies that show that people who transition younger are astronomically more likely to commit suicide. People who are post-op, suicide rate goes up astronomically. I put myself much more at risk of suicide and suicidal ideation by having bottom surgery than by not. And in actuality, after bottom surgery, my dysphoria and obsession just shifted. It just shifted, and now it's gone. Now I don't care about looking like a woman. Now I don't care about being perceived that way. Now I don't care about how I sound or how I look, and I can go out being rough and stuff, and I'm not as obsessive. I'm not as tortured or as depressed. I don't feel
But
bad
aren't
about
but
my
aren't you
body in the
tortured?
same way.
I mean, I would imagine, you know, as a woman of a certain age, you look at your body and you go, "Oh, that's not the body I used to have." And personally, I feel like, "Ugh, I don't like it."
I
But I
feel
cannot imagine if I went
disassociated
under
from
the
what I've
knife.
done.
What'd you
I
say?
feel disassociated from what I've
Okay,
done. But the
okay.
thing is like after doing all of this, the pain didn't go away. The
So you live in
obsession
con
didn't go away. Like the drive to do this didn't go away after bottom surgery at all. And so I felt like I was sold a cure that didn't work. I was sold a treatment that wasn't going to work. And so and another thing, like in part, I think I gave myself gender dysphoria in transition. Like I started with this obsession around my genitals, extreme discomfort around my genitals, like nails on a chalkboard whenever I kissed a guy. I would kiss a guy, I'd swoon, I'd be so happy, my body would respond. Nails on a chalkboard, with the chalkboard being my skull, and that was trauma induced, right? That was very much trauma induced. But as
Did you
I
was it guilty? Because you were raised in a I don't remember if you told me religious
it
family, but
wasn't
definitely
that, it was an associative memory of being touched as a kid.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it wasn't the guilt over being homosexual. It was an
okay.
associative memory.
Did you
Um,
ever have guilt on that? I'm just
no,
wondering. No,
not really.
so
Not.
it's different because you're, as you
I
said,
had I had this desire to be normal because I didn't want
okay,
to be abused. I didn't want to be gay because I didn't want to be abused. I didn't want to be gay because I didn't want another reason for people to hurt me. I was already being called, agate and the smear the queer. I was the queer being smeared in high school and in middle school. And I didn't even accept that I was attracted to men until I was 15, but I was being smeared as being gay in middle school,
oh god,
and I was
yeah.
coming out of this horrible abusive situation. So that caused me to have a lot of self hate, but not shame, more just like hatred because I couldn't be normal and I couldn't get with girls. I couldn't have a girlfriend. I couldn't be what I was supposed to be, you know?
Um, Okay, so I'd sent you some things about the safe schools and Glisten, and I think you said you were in GSAs in school. Yes?
GSAs, you
A
mean
Gay Straight Alliance or
oh,
just no, you weren't in
no,
those. Okay.
no.
Okay. Because I'm wondering what you feel like are they justified, these clubs that are gender and sexuality clubs in schools? And the reason I'm asking if they're justified, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, but if you were the victim of bullying and smear the queer and things like that, wouldn't having a club that told you not only were you accepted, but that you were special, would you have wanted something like that?
No, I would have wanted the system not to be the way it was in the 90s. So in the 90s, if you got in a fight, even if the kid was running up to you, calling you an agate, and beating the crap out of you, both of you got referrals, which is horrible. Punishing the victim is
Right.
horrible. What
And
I
we
would
still
have,
do that
and
today.
and
Mhm.
it's not about glorifying being gay. Kids don't need to be taught that they're gay. You'll figure it out. I figured it out, right? I didn't need to be told that I was special at all. What I needed was the adults to regulate the violence in a fair way. And you don't even have to talk about gay. If you hit a kid, regardless if they're gay, if it's because you don't like their skin tone or their religion, you should be punished by the school. And that's it. That's the end of the line. You don't need support groups run in the schools. You don't need educational classes run in the school. Like beyond safe sex practices, like what you do, like, later on in high school, which is just like how not to get a girl pregnant, how not to get diseased. I don't
Yeah.
think any of this needs to be taught at all because they'll figure it out. And we don't need to, you shouldn't be glorifying any identity in the school because that's the opposite of promoting equality and egalitarianism. Like I believe in the approach of like we're all human regardless of who you're attracted to, the color of your skin, your religious beliefs. And I think instead of centering children on focusing on identity, we should center children on focusing on we're all human. Right? You don't need to have a little badge to be
I mean,
special.
preach.
You're special
I
just by
agree.
being a human, by being an American, by being a unique person all on your own, and you don't need a list of labels.
Right. You don't need a box to be put into.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people will say, well, this is empowering. But I find that when you empower some at the expense of others, you build more hatred than there was to start with.
Right, right. And we're doing this whole thing, which I mean, I think it's the wrong approach, where instead of promoting seeing each other as people, we're promoting looking at the color of someone's skin tone, queuing up oppression points, queuing
Mhm.
up where people fit into society, and seeing the world in a hierarchical lens, instead of just seeing each other as people and treating each other with basic decency and respect. And I think this is the approach that's actually degrading communication between Americans.
Yeah. So let's talk about terms like kindness. And I'm guessing I probably already understand where you're coming from, but what do you expect what did you expect when you were fully trans? And does that change what you expect as a detransitioner, or were you always
So I was never pronoun police. I was old school. I just did my thing. If people called me a different pronoun, I just rolled it off my back and let it go. Like if it made me feel bad, but I wasn't going to police people's speech. And like that's how I operate. I'm a very non-conforming, confusing person to look at. And you've met me. We've met in person. You like I met Nancy Mace at the Young Women's Leadership Summit and told her like 3 minutes of my story condensed to like being a
Yeah.
survivor, misdiagnosed, blah blah. And she thought I was a woman for a second. She was like, "You go tell other women your story. They need to hear that." And I was like, "Oh no, Nancy, I'm not a woman. I'm a gay guy who is trans." And she was like, "Oh, and you're a beautiful gay man. You go tell women what they did to you." And I was like, "I knew you weren't homophobic." And she was like, "No, definitely not."
There's a
Like,
difference between I mean, so here's my thought. When I met you, and even before I started talking to you today, I almost said she. because I look at you, you're chic. You're like Audrey
Oh.
Hepburn. So that is my first thought, but I get to have my thought, and you don't get to compel my speech. That's where the line is drawn for me. If I see somebody and automatically in my head I think lovely woman, then that's what my head thinks, and that shouldn't be something that makes me illegal or hateful or that I should be doxxed for. None of that. Because I honestly think that people who think they should patrol our speech should probably be, they should be on a watch list.
Well, and it, yeah, it exists on both sides of the spectrum there. Like, if you
Yeah,
slipped up on my pronouns on a film and called me she, there would be some crazy radical
yeah,
people being like, he's a man, he's an adult human male, da 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 da.
right,
And if it was a trans person here and you called him he, like, there would
right,
be a bunch of trans people. You didn't respect her pronouns.
right.
And it exists on both sides. But
I
really,
just
I
don't
mean,
play the emperor's new clothes, and you don't get to control
right,
me. Like, I'm sorry, but fundamentally what I am is an individual, and I get
right.
to have my thoughts right or wrong, right?
Hmm.
So,
I
right,
don't. I feel like it would be super annoying as a detransitioner if I went out there and was like, actually, I'm a gay man. Nope, nope.
right,
He.
yeah,
Especially when I have long hair and I was on estrogen for over half my life and have had so many modifications to my body, my stature. People are going to get confused, and
right,
so what I do is I try to behave in a pro-social way. Whereas if I'm like going and just buying a slushie at the 7-Eleven and I walk out and he's like, have a good day, ma'am, I'm just going to say thank you. That's it. You know, I'm not going to be like, actually, like, thanks for your well wishes, but, I'm
right,
not
right.
doing that. But,
Well, it's always assuming it's good for society to assume the best from people.
except there's a level of antisocial behavior that I do, and that's I go into the men's always. I don't care if it causes a scene. I don't care if guys are confused when I walk in there. Sometimes I might be wearing a suit. Sometimes I might be out to dinner with my hubby and I'm wearing a dress and pretty shoes and have my hair all done and or some acrylics. I love my acrylics. When I went into the bathroom at America Fest, I had some big old conservative men looking down on me going like, "Are you in the right bathroom?" Because I think they probably thought I was a trans-identified female going into the men's because I'm so tiny.
Right,
But I was
yeah,
in my suit, so they were like, "Are you in the?" I was like, "Actually, yeah, no, I am."
yeah. Well, I mean, it was never a big deal until people made it, and I think we've heard that a million times. We've definitely heard that with the race conversation. It was never a big deal until people made it a big deal, and they made it a big deal because they want a revolution. Now, the reason I asked about the targeting is because it seems to me that so many people who are causing the extreme violence are not only trans, but they're also on the autism spectrum. And they are being taught that those who do not agree with them, who do not not just affirm, but who do not celebrate them, are their enemy.
This is so, again, this is where it goes back to a cult. This is where it's almost like a radical religion, right? Because you're being taught that you are at risk of suicide. You're going to kill yourself if you don't get affirmed, if you don't transition. Astronomical numbers like 60% are thrown around out there. Even though historically, if you go back pre WPATH standards to the Harry Benjamin standard, it was less than 4% had suicidal ideation and body mutilation risks. Harry Benjamin even had a chart, and under type 6 transsexualism was the only one where it had those as comorbid issues and symptoms of the issue. Only the most severe cases. And type 6 transsexuals were desperate to have bottom surgery. They were less than 4% of the trans identified population at the time. So I don't know how that went from 4% to 60%, but when you're taught you're going to kill yourself, you're vulnerable, you're at risk, like if people don't affirm you, and then you feel bad and you're obsessing, you're on the spectrum, you have deep rumination, you're also being told these people hate you, they want you to die, they're Nazis, it's a genocide, all of this hysteria that's being promoted in the media by trans activists is having a hugely adverse impact on trans identified people with comorbid mental illness who are indoctrinated into these beliefs. And so I don't think it's every single trans identified person who's just going to pop off, and I would never say that. But within trans, there are bubbles of ideologies that are just dangerous like that. There are thought patterns you can get sucked into that will radicalize you. And those same bubbles exist in other different political ideologies, and they're comorbid with trans as well. We can see in the Canadian shooter, he had Nazi tattoos on his arm. He was radical. He was indoctrinated into a radical segment of right wing politics. And he
Yeah.
was trans and had obsessive levels of neuroses and was an autogynephile. So he had a lot of things compounding that led up to him going ballistic and killing his family in a hawking ring. He had radical political beliefs across the spectrum.
Right. Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's a whole nother argument on, like, I really don't see it as a line. I see far left and far right as basically being
A horseshoe.
all people willing to hate.
Horseshoe. It's a horseshoe. It's a horseshoe, and the further down the right and the left you get, the closer you get to. It's like,
Yeah.
that's what it
Yes.
is. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
on the left you've got the crazy far right Antifa, or far
Yeah.
left Antifa, and on the right you have the crazy far right, like, ethno nationalists and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and all of it is frightening, and we just didn't need to be there. I don't think I would have ever cared about the trans issue if it wasn't, like I said, shoved down my throat, and specifically shoved down. So, like, I knew a young woman, young, like 14, and she went to Victoria's Secret in Orem. This is Utah, mind you. Okay, went to Victoria's Secret in Orem, and the person who was going to size her was a huge burly man in a dress. And she wasn't supposed to have a reaction to it. And what one of the things that makes me it's really frustrating is to watch kids go, "Who's going to help me here?" And the parents, there's two things. There's the trans house and mommies, and then there's also the parents who know it's wrong, hate it, but are afraid to speak up.
I think people in your audience would benefit, if they don't know about her, from watching Amy Sousa. Amy Sousa is an amazing woman. She's a turf. She does education on boundaries and setting boundaries for women, reinforcing your boundaries, especially in dealing with trans ideology. And that's really, you don't want to put a child in a position where their instincts are telling them, no, this isn't okay, I don't feel comfortable, I'm not safe. And you, as a parent, have put blinders on because you don't want to be seen as a bigot, and you're effectively looking the other way from that discomfort. That discomfort is natural. They should feel uncomfortable. A little girl should not feel comfortable letting a grown ass man with a paraphilia size her for a bra. And as a parent, it's not only okay for you to be like, nope, find someone else to help my child. I need a real woman. I need a female, and use whatever language you're comfortable with to express it. But it's 100% okay to do that as a parent, and you should. You absolutely should. I feel like this is just a recreation of that mindset men have developed, where men will look past a woman who's having her boundaries crossed or being touched in a train or on a bus or walking down the alley. You hear a woman scream and you don't even look. You're like, blinders. Nope.
Mhm.
And we're being trained to go against our instincts as a society. Men are being trained not to protect women and children by trans ideology. Mothers are being trained not to protect their children by trans ideology. The fact of the matter is if you go back 75 years ago, we had sex impersonation laws in many states. We had a cultural setup where a man would not only be expected to, he was empowered to grab a man if he was going into the women's bathroom and be like, "Nah, buddy, my wife and kids see you."
Right.
No, absolutely not. And it didn't matter if that man was cross dressing or not, you were expected to do that. Now, men have had our hands tied, and we know, oh, if I'm uncomfortable with that cross dresser that just walked in after my niece and I pull him out, I'm going to be charged with a hate crime. We need to restore our society to proper safeguarding in regards to women. And that means not allowing males into female spaces and removing this social system that has hogtied society from actually protecting women and children.
And how do we do that? Because I mean, there's laws that prioritize these people. And I know when I had asked you and you would explain this little bit to me because I said, why do these people want to look? I'm trying to find an appropriate word. I don't have one, like clowns. What's going on there? Because it seems like it's a mockery of womanhood.
It's not that they want to look like clowns, it's that they're autogynephiles that are operating on euphoria. So, autogynephilia is a man's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a woman. And autogynephiles basically experience dopamine, positive feelings, relaxing, a self of right sense of rightness in many cases from expressing their autogynephilia. In some cases, I've had AGPs tell me it's like the most pleasurable orgasm they've ever experienced, like a drug, a button they can't stop hitting, right?
Mhm.
And so there's some AGPs that are very much escalating through that euphoria, very much like an addiction, not like a chemical addiction, but more like a behavioral addiction, where they're getting a lot of positive feelings from cross dressing and from doing these things, and that kind of blinds them to how they look. What ends up happening is over time, they're desensitized to the actions. So at first, they might steal their wife's underwear, like Bruce Jenner stole his daughter's underwear, and that would have been huge for him, huge stimulant. Over time, wearing women's underwear would be a lesser stimulant, and he'd seek more and more and more. And so they're very much operating like drug addicts. Um,
Okay.
and they're doing a level of conditioning to their brain because they're fantasizing about themselves as women and reinforcing that with dopamine and pleasure from sex. And so they
So
create
it's
this
not a
association.
maliciousness. There's not a we hate women so much that we want to rub it in their faces that we get treated better than them. That's not really what's going on.
No, it's more like a misogyny fetish, you know? It's more like they have had their heterosexuality misdirected onto themselves, and so they're turning themselves into a sexual caricature of a woman, chasing the fantasy of being the kind of woman they're attracted to. And as they do that, they're creating this new self-image of themselves as that woman and reinforcing it with positive chemicals, which does classical conditioning. Then they're like Pavlov's dog. They're hitting that button for the fix, basking in the euphoria, right? And you know how an alcoholic will be like, I like it when I'm drunk more, people like me more, I'm more sociable, I communicate more, I'm more loved. That's
Mhm.
because they're classically conditioning themselves to like being drunk with, the way that works. With AGP, they're conditioning themselves to see themselves as this woman. Like all of their positive feelings are being associated with girl mode. And so boy mode is being associated with all of the negative feelings. They go from chasing a high to hating reality because the only way they feel good is when they're in this delusion. Does that make sense?
It does, but, so you call yourself Animosity Ari and an apostate, and you're hated by a lot of people. I mean, I have nightmares from a video you showed last week of just
I'm
those people
sorry.
making you walk backwards,
I'm
right?
sorry.
It's okay. But you're so if people would listen, my gosh, you're compassionate to these people, right? I'm sorry, I'm gonna cry, but you're very compassionate to them, because I do listen to and have some trans exclusionary radical feminists who they post their stuff and they're just like, these guys are gross, they're blah blah blah. And look, I don't it's not the wording that I would choose to use because I'm not that person. But I do feel like, I mean, I've been in the store, like a thrift store, right? Where you're standing in the store and somebody who's obviously male is has guards of women protecting them while they're trying on clothes in the aisle and hogging up the whole aisle. And you do feel like, what the heck is going on here? Sorry, that's my Mormon language. But but like, you feel like, why are they allowed to do this? And you're just supposed to shut up and take it, and that does feel like you're being bullied. But you are coming from a place of compassion, going, they feel this way because of this. And I just it makes me sad for you that you're such an understanding human being.
I wasn't like that originally. I was hurt. Girl, my at was transphobe '01 when I hit that wall. There's a W Path doctor that leaked pictures of my DMs when I was talking to him when I hit that wall, and I was suicidal. I was depressed. I had trans people harassing me, constantly blackmailing me, releasing images of me when I was being sold or selling myself when I was younger and homeless, and I was dark and angry. Um, but I researched a lot and I knew a lot about it, and I kind of weaponized it for a while. Um, and then eventually I cracked. I came out as a detransitioner, and I found empathy and compassion actually. This is a new thing for me as of May of 2025. I went to this prayer rattle. I was attacked by Antifa. I was standing on a balcony looking at 1,000 Christians singing, and I had like a very surreal spiritual moment, and that kind of mixed in with months of meeting trans widows and mothers of sons who have transitioned who are AGP, and all these scenarios where I was seeing the other side of the coin, the people that were being hurt by the lie. And not just like the gay boys being indoctrinated, but the men who were exposed to porn as a kid or had some kind of emotional wound or issues with their mother, and then they get online and they kind of get fed this ideology, and none of the doctors know what they're going through or are there to help them, or the wives who know exactly what their husband's going through, but the Reddit group full of AGPs who have transitioned are telling their husband that they're trans, they need to transition, and they lose their whole family. You know, they're treated like bigots because they know what autogynephilia is. They lose their husband. They watch him change before their eyes into a completely different person. It destroys their marriage. It destroys their family. Um, and ultimately it's a failing of our society that we got hoodwinked by transgender ideology, that we never got to the point of diagnosing this paraphilia as it is and getting adequate intervention for these men, because this is no different than the heroin epidemic in our country. It's no different than any of the other drug epidemics. We have a sex and perversion epidemic in the United States of America. We have an ideology based around gender that is giving an outlet for a paraphilia that destroys lives. It destroys fathers, it destroys husbands, it destroys teenagers. Like, and we need to actually do something about it. So I moved past anger to we just really need to address this. Our country
How do
needs a
we
revival.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the solution is the one that's the most mocked. So, but so what I see the most here, I live in the world of awfuls. I live in the world of affluent white liberal. females, right?
Oh God.
I mean, the height of it, because then you have to add on to that liberal, religiously liberal. So, and they're gutting the antidote. They're gutting churches and saying churches need to be affirming, right? It's so it's an interesting place.
It's happening everywhere. I went into a Catholic church for my first confession of my life and accidentally got a liberal PNW Catholic priest. And
Oh,
he
yeah.
made excuses for me. I was like,
Yeah.
I worked myself up for it for months. I put it off for the whole year. I was like, I want to go to a confession and talk about what
Yeah.
I've been through and really spill on trans and on my life and nothing.
It's a really hard, um we live in the emperor's new clothes, but what do we do? First off, how do those of us who do feel bullied by it? I mean, I remember all I asked was, if there's such a transitioning issue, if we have so many kids who are transitioning in our district. Mind you, I live in the town where Footloose was filmed. Okay. So I live in small town USA. And so if we have so many people, why don't we show them the other side? Because and I said, I listened to this person, Benjamin Boyce, and he's got hundreds of interviews with detransitioners, and it seems to me like, if you're going to show the kids one side, you should show them both so that they don't have regrets in the future. And some educator jumped on and said, you are feeding the genocide epidemic. I know. And I'm sitting there going, I'm the most mild-mannered. Like, that's just not what I'm interested in. I think that the kids have a right to not have resentment in the future for something they didn't understand.
Carrie, I have a question for you.
Yeah,
Okay, so if without all of these medical interventions, like trans people would just die, right? If without the breast surgeries, the penis inversions, without the hormones, trans people would just die, right? And trans people have always existed. Where's the body trail pre 1895?
right.
HRT was invented by this guy. Prior to this guy inventing transition, there was no
Got
medical
money?
transition. Magnus Hirschfeld. No,
Okay.
Magnus, yeah, 1895 to 1920s, Magnus Hirschfeld and Havelock Ellis studying gender nonconformity in heterosexuals and homosexuals, the Hirschfeld Institute, the invention of Titus's pearls and the original forms of estrogen and testosterone. All of that is post 1900.
But
Where's the
when
body
they revise
trail?
history, they tell you things like Hatshepsut was trans. And so that's what our kids are getting in education. Is it true? No. But that's what they're getting. That's what the kids are getting. And then and they're not presented with two sides of a story
Well,
ever.
it's kind of like John Money. John Money appropriated a bunch of different indigenous cultures in this book, Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment, that was written in the 60s. And John Money said that gender identity was proven to be real because he took a child that had a botched circumcision and he did a sex change operation on an infant and raised an infant to be a girl. Okay? And then when that infant failed, he said, like, collapsed mentally, could not be a girl, right?
Right.
He said, this is because gender identity is innate. And the reason some people can do this and other people can't is because it's innate. And that's not really true. What happened is he performed a human experiment on a child that then later went on to detransition and kill himself. Okay. And the reason some people are happy post op is probably because they're autogynephiles getting some level of their paraphilic dreams.
Yeah. And we also don't have enough to know how long, because the people that I watch, like Buck Angel, these are people who, like, they'll openly say, I'm not a man, and they're allowed to tell the truth. And I really do think that this ultimately comes down to an attack on truth all the way across.
Oh,
Like,
definitely.
just that's the whole point. And if you can, sterilize a whole lot of people in the process, then so be it. Um,
100%.
but I'm very interested in how we get people to a point where they love truth and where they're not afraid of it. Because, I mean, you've got to be afraid. Ari, when I saw that video, I was afraid for you, and I'm afraid. And you do it anyways. But how do you get past the point of, and how do you get the normies to the point where you realize you're sacrificing your own kids here? Your your kids will not even know what truth is.
I think they need to see a lot more detransitioners, honestly. I think they need to see the consequences and actually be willing to ask those questions because, I mean, we have a lot of propaganda out there. They say the regret rate's only 1%, but we don't even have studies that reach out into the regret window. Like
Yeah.
they take a poll of their own community and they say this poll proves that detransition and regret is low. Like people like me who have become apostates are answering polls of the trans community. We're not.
Right. Right.
We're not.
Well, and they don't care because, again, I say it all the time, there is no truth but power to these people.
Regret from double gonadectomy is 8 to 10 years. Like I said earlier, clinical studies are only 2 to 5 years max. Research studies have a 20 to 60% fall off. Also, don't go back a decade post surgery. So we don't know how
Right.
many people regret this. We know it's somewhere between 1 to 13%, maybe higher, but we don't even have the mechanisms to measure it. Because we can go pull insurance data and tell you how many gender dysphoria diagnoses have been given. We have no ICD 10 code or diagnostic code for detransition, for regret from transition. So we have no way of tracking it in a comparable, we have no comparable way of tracking it to dysphoria diagnoses at all. We can't say what the regret rates are. We are operating blindly with human experimentation, and we have opened the gates to allow children into that human experimentation. It was madness before we started allowing children to do it. Now it's like absolute insanity.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else? Where can people follow you? I know you're
Apostate
all
Ari
over.
everywhere.
Apostate Ari, not Ari Animosity anymore. Okay,
Mm-mm.
I'll change that on the thumbnail. Well, I very much appreciate this conversation. I want to close it down just so that it'll let us upload easily. And
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate it, Ari.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
please,
Thanks for
please
having me
keep.
on.
Yes, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.